And try.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Hi.
There we go. How you doing?
How are you?
Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. And you?
Good. Done my heavy travel, so I'm back back at work with a little bit more time to spend on all kinds of things. This being one of them.
Great.
But we've had a couple of sessions with the VSMC in the meantime, and I think we've got a couple of updates that you folks might be interested in.
Sorry for being late.
Hi, Emil.
Hi.
Great. So let me share it on the and there and ready.
I added some information there, Andrea, since you initiated it, with some input from earlier discussions we've had on the SIG mostly. So to link the reference architecture and the charter, and then some conclusions or discussions we have had. I call it open issues. I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but anyway, things we are discussing.
That's great.
Great, thanks, Emil. Okay, so since you mentioned you have updates for us, Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, I could
start the discussion.
I could share my screen. We've kind of
okay.
did a little bit of work.
Stop sharing that.
It's mostly visual changes to kind of like the reference visualization. So this is kind of what we've been putting together to kind of establish a large scale representation of the landscape, where we have the familiar activity layers, where you'll see that we're representing slightly more scope than something like CDEvents would have in its immediate purview. But CDEvents being recognized on the ingress layer, primarily focused on real time and pull services. I guess you guys, do you have any incorporation of something like pull services, or is it primarily just ingestion of broadcasted events?
What is the pull service?
The pull service being a service that goes and fetches data with an API call. I don't know if you guys have a different phrase for that, or a different name.
Yeah, I think I get it. I mean, the protocol itself, the event protocol itself it's not a pull service, obviously, but then of course the consumers of the events, I mean, the events themselves could contain references to additional data from external sources somewhere, say a reference to a GitHub repository or something like that. Then the consumer of this event could go and fetch, of course, pull more information from. That's what. And then, of course, in the CDEvents ecosystem as such, there could be services that listen to CDEvents and then go out to those external services to pull information from there. So, of course, obviously, in the CDEvents landscape, yes, pull services should exist, but not as part of the protocol itself, really. But URLs or references to such services is in the scope to keep in the protocol, I think.
Got it. And is it fair to characterize CDEvents as a message broker?
Not the broker itself. I think I'm not exactly sure what the broker term really means, but I mean, to me, broker is more of the infrastructure layer below CDEvents. CDEvents being the semantic specification on top of any events sent on any broker, or yeah.
So, got it.
I guess
Let
the
me
broker
go back to
doesn't
your
really
representation here.
Yeah, okay. So I think that the broker doesn't really care what the information is contained with the messages or the events sent there, but CDEvents does care about that rather than caring about how the infrastructure
Right.
looks.
Right. Okay, got it. Is it fair to characterize it as a protocol then?
I would say so. CDEvents is a protocol, yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay. And then we recognize historical content as well because of the possibility of ingestion from a data store, which may end up being our primary source, but we don't know. We have very little current implementation or ad hoc implementation to reference. That's probably one of our next steps, is to go and ask a bunch of folks what they're doing to get more insight into how they're dealing with this historical data. But we have representation of that. Yeah, go ahead.
When you say events there, do you mean events in the same term the way as we use in CDEvents, or is it more general, any events? It could be like open telemetry events or such things as well, or
it could be. I mean, telemetry events would be less interesting in the VSM context.
Yeah.
But really any kind of it's actually, so it does involve events. Let's say I should probably separate these out, because what I would say, these are kind of correlating to the stages of this workflow, or let's say this cycle of events. But we typically pay closer attention to things on the right than things on the left. But I think in the workflow context, if we're talking about work items, we do care about change management, release management. How long does it take to do the security testing? When does that happen? When do all these things actually complete? Not necessarily how long they take, because these take far less time than things like portfolio planning. And if you're thinking about the performance of workflow, you care a lot more about how long things are stuck in any given stage. But I guess that's very similar to your context as well. But to answer your question, I hope we would be looking at events that are emitted by any of these activities. Events being this thing happened.
Yep.
Which we would imagine are primarily stored in a like a data lake, or something, and not together currently, right? I mean, part of this, I think, is what does a VSMI data store look like, which is a layer above. So basically, if you have a store of data, if you're collecting data from various sources, not all that data is really relevant to value stream management or workflow. So the broker would basically be collecting data that's defined as relevant or imagined to be relevant. Let's say you could dial it to different levels of granularity. And that would then store a subset of this data in a data store that was optimized for analysis and access to that data, maybe even a different level of permissions and ownership, or just governance in general. And then you would have the model and ontology, and we've done a little bit of representation of model and ontology in the next slide that I'll get into. But that's really just about representing the data in a useful way for the purposes of value stream management. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah.
And then we have the practice of actual value stream management, which would rely on this data store, let's say, and hopefully decouple the act of representing and manipulating the value stream management data, what's relevant, from the storage and maintenance of that underlying data, meaning that you could use different tools on top of this. You could change tools easily. You could experiment with open source. You could create your own representations of this. And this will live in various places in various ways, right? In a mature ecosystem. But the layers that we identified as relevant to this is being able to see that data, being guided by that data. So having a layer that is providing some analysis beyond just raw representation, or observation, I should say, because representation, we're probably going to throw these words around in different contexts for a little while. And then we have beyond that, those basic use cases, prediction and simulation. So understanding, okay, if we understand this data and we're able to see patterns, what does that provide us in terms of being able to represent different scenarios, predict future performance, and simulate possible scenarios?
Nice. Yeah, this looks very interesting. I think I mean, we don't have anything to this level of details in terms of layers on the CDEvent side, but I think the general architecture is similar in a way to what some of our end users are doing. So, for instance, Fidelity, which is the first CDEvents adopter, they have a similar approach where they receive all events from the different tools. Well, from Jenkins, that's the core bit that runs activity in their environment.
Mm-hmm.
But they collect in all these events in what they call evidence store. And then they have like this evidence store, which allows them to do different kind of things. So they can evaluate things that are in this evidence store, take decisions for future activities. They can use this data to build like maybe audit trail of an artifact. So they can run, so they can analyze this data and have different business logic on top of it, basically. So yeah, and the fact that there is CDEvents as a common format coming from the different parts of their workflows means that the layer that you have as a yellow layer there in this picture, it's probably much simpler for them because they don't need to adapt layer data coming from different sources to a common format. So they can have they already have like a standard format they know how to handle.
Yeah, I think that's kind of at the heart of this challenge. And I like that we've represented it fairly basically and fairly crudely with this 4-segment definition of what kind of events we're interested in. But hopefully that covers the idea that this is multiple different tools. Some there, I don't even think it's possible to have one tool do all this today, but they're increasingly kind of there's large software vendors that are kind of acquiring solutions in each of these areas and then aggregating them into value stream management, or what they call it, kind of portfolio life cycle, or whatever they want to name it. But this doesn't actually exist yet. So the need is, there's definitely a need to be collecting, if you want to do this, to collect data from all these different separate tools. And then you have to do this kind of assembly and normalization. Emil, any reactions, any questions?
No, not really. I mean, from the CDEvents protocol perspective, we don't really care too much how the upper layers look,
Right.
let's say, and
Right.
so that's fine either way, I think. This looks like a well thought through structure. So for the VSMI, for the VSM use case, I think this is perfectly suitable, and I'm glad to see that CDEvents could play a role in this structure as well, and as an information bearer from the bottom there. So yeah, it looks promising.
I mean, it's really nice for us to be able to point to you folks as a protocol and existing project in the space, because a lot of this is so new. I mean, even CDEvents is new in relative terms, right? But in relative terms, we're far newer, and we are trying to bite off this huge piece of observability with this. So it's nice to be able to have you folks as guides and second opinions.
So I would also expect my requirements coming from the upper layers here down to eventually to CDEvents to say what information is needed from CDEvents to be able to provide this added value on top.
Yeah, so that I think has to be, that's a good point. There's almost like a life cycle need. I don't want it. I'm going to show all my cards for the next piece of this puzzle, but I like that idea, because this topology doesn't tell you how it's actually valuable or going to be used. So that's a good idea.
So preferably stating what properties in the CDEvents themselves is relevant for the VSMI use case, VSM use case, or VSMI, whatever. And maybe what additional things that we don't have today needs to eventually to be able to provide even better benefits on the top layers.
Yeah, I think that would be really valuable. I think, when we look at, you guys have a lot of granularity here that is far beyond what we would look for, but there are certainly entities that I'm not quite sure you folks would even have visibility into. Like when something comes into Jenkins, there's no current correlation aside from, let's say, maybe a Jira tag, right, that associates it with something in Jira that's going to be notified as to the status. So there's some correlation there, but we're likely pulling directly from Jira to form that. Well, I guess the order doesn't really matter, but we would have a representation from Jira to associate, okay, well, here's what happened when it got to Jenkins. But what's interesting to us at this like early stage is kind of like the clock starts at plan and we're looking at all of the activity. How many people have to be involved in this? Where does it go? How long does it sit around doing nothing? Does it get broken up? Does it get rescoped? And then all the way through.
Do you expect activities like that to be notified through events towards your hyper layers there as well, or would you rather hold that information regularly or have it pushed to in some other means than using events?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it depends what's possible with the tool. I know that as an engineering leader, what I would want is to be notified when there's a major scope change because it has downstream implications. So I might want to know if something has significantly changed. But in terms of real-time events, I don't think they're as valuable as, let's say, in terms of real-time, historical, and then simulation and prediction. Prediction and simulation are very valuable. Historical is probably the most valuable because prediction and simulation is unreliable and relies on all kinds of variables. And then real time being the least valuable because you can't typically act on anything that's real time in a meaningful way, because you just end up being overreactive. It'd be like day trading, right? Like we know that the best way to trade is to just put your money in a system and just wait, but put your money in the right place. This is really about how do you put your money in the right place, not day trading and reacting to market signals or trying to game the market. So the focus is different. But that's today, right? I mean, it's hard to say what the focus will be in the future, but I suspect prediction and simulation will be much higher value. And what you could do with real-time events in the value stream world is less significant. Because I think what you care about in the CDEvents world is how do we optimize the system, but also like when is the system overloaded? When do we need to address a problem with the system? When is it not doing its job?
Well,
because
not really, I would say. That's more for operations personnel of the system itself, looking into, are our servers loaded now? Do we need to add more hardware? Can we release some hardware from this part and put it there? I mean, such things is not really a concern of CDEvent. I mean, that would more be, to me, OpenTelemetry data really influencing that.
Yeah.
But CDEvents is more about declaring this specific source change. It's now our starting point. It could be a requirement instead, but I think currently we focus on a source change being created as our starting point. And then what happens to that source change? Well, is it tested? Is it statically linted and such things? Is it built? Are the built artifacts then tested as well? Are they deployed somewhere? Are they working well in the customer environment and those things? So that's currently the scope of CDEvents. But we are, as I said, then looking into also referencing issues, which will then be, yes, for example, in this case. So there we go more to the left of this picture from development box, or more to the design box, and even maybe to the plan box if the Jira tickets are there. So we are discussing introducing we haven't talked about the naming too much, but like an issue created event or something like that states that now we have a new Jira ticket, which will eventually be referenced in a source change down the line. But then I don't think that we intend to implement too many actions or what should I say, predicates on that issue, notifying when it has been changed in many different ways, as you were into as well, when the scope is changed for an issue, or when it has been assigned to some team member or such things. It's not too interesting maybe for a CDEvents from a CDEvents perspective, but rather when it has been included in the source change is interesting. But I think we need to reference it there. So we will, for sure, as you said earlier, there have a reference to the Jira tickets somehow, the Jira ticket reference in the CDEvent. Now there's a new source change, and then the pull service on top of that, or maybe even the data lake or some system there could then fetch more information from the Jira system based on that Jira ticket to build a full picture of what happened earlier, if that's interesting in the ticketing system.
Yeah, that would be interesting. That would be that would allow for kind of closer to real-time monitoring of the workflow. That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I expect that what we would call a flow guardian or track guardian in our world, in Ericsson at least, would sit on and looking at some dashboard somewhere, seeing that, well, now this product there is some new feature being developed for it, and now there is something delivered for this new feature, and now that feature is into this specific test loop, and it has passed this test loop, or it failed it, but it went back to development to fix it. I mean, those kind of dashboards would be interesting to be able to show for any such or flow guardian, as we call it, and I would expect that information to be notified through events, which would eventually be CDEvents in our case then. But leverage, of course, with data from other sources through this pull services, such things.
And so speaking to that scenario, maybe at a higher level, do you have any kind of representation of events as related to products or portfolios, so that you could actually say this is the performance of this family of products or this specific product across all of its apps? Because you have that taxonomy of, or that level of granularity where you have one CI/CD pipeline is a single microservice, which is part of an application, which is part of a product, which is part of a portfolio, which is part of maybe a division. And upwards and upwards.
Yes.
Sorry.
We also state these, what we call confidence levels or maturity levels on each of these different levels then of the product structures, let's say. So we could state the microservice, the confidence on the microservice itself, and then when it is included in some application, we can state the confidence on that, depending on how much we have tested it, and then we can have confidence on all these levels as well, which we currently notify through events.
But that's something that you're talking about with something that you do on Ericsson's side.
Yeah,
I know, right?
Yeah.
So, but we don't have. I wouldn't say we have anything like that in CDEvents today. So we don't have any concept of product or things like that in CDEvents today. So,
and I would imagine that's beyond scope, right? But you would leave it to another another implementation, another tool to kind of represent what are these events, what is the context of these events, and how do they relate to other things?
Well, not exactly. I think, for example, if we talk about these hierarchies of products, they will somewhat be represented in software bill of materials in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the software bill of material for a microservice application or a cloud application would then show all its microservices. And then the microservices will have an SBOM of all its libraries or source code components that it might up on, and also going up in the chain in the same way. And those SBOMs should also, as I see it, be referenced from these events. We don't have that today in CDEvents either, and not even in the protocol we use in Ericsson. We have something similar to it. We actually have the SBOM itself as an event. So we have the whole SBOM represented within an event itself, but that's maybe not how we will represent it in CDEvents. So yeah, we have somehow, at least in Ericsson, in our events system, we have that kind of hierarchy in some sense implemented, and I would expect at least to be able to trace it from the events, even though it might not be included in the events explicitly, the structure.
Got it. Any other points or questions on this? I could jump to the next thing, unless you guys have thoughts.
The other thing I wanted to mention is in CDEvents, we have two main use cases that we target. And one is the more real time to kind of try and map to this, which is if you have one tool, for instance, doing certain activities, you send events and you may have other tools reacting to those activities in real time. So you can have a build that triggers a pipeline, or you could have a pipeline that triggers a notification or some other testing or whatever. But the other use case that we have is more in the direction of the historical type of data, if you will. So having all the tools from our point of view, having all the different tools in your tool chain producing CDEvents allows our end users to collect all the data across the workflows, and then kind of crunch that data at the later stage, so that you can build things like metrics, for instance. So you can see how efficient your pipelines are, where most of the time is spent, where maybe bottlenecks and wrong things happening, and you can use that to decide how to optimize or where to invest in your architecture to, where you have to inject work or resources. So I think it maps nicely to the two layers that you have there of ingress and history type of views.
But to be more accurate, you would say that CDEvents could be represented in both layers.
Yeah, I think so. So you could take the same data that you use for real-time interactions and store it. And because we are also specifically now working on features to be able to better correlate events with each other, which means that once you have all these events stored in a data store, data lake, you would be able then to correlate these events together and see what happened after the fact, and use that information to produce metrics.
Okay, that's great.
Apply, so that's
like I definitely see a real-time opportunity here, because I think that if you're processing real-time events combined with a prediction and simulation layer, or even just an intelligence layer, you could say that based on certain things happening, they either put your let's say timeline or your estimated delivery capacity or performance at risk. And you'd be notified as that's happening so that you could intervene. So something like if we take something that was planned and we start work on it, we get all the way to deployment, and then the specifications change on it, then that might be something you want to pay attention to. That could be beneficial or detrimental. Or if you, if you delete something that's in progress, then you might want to be alerted that there's been a substantial change that's happened before you go through this entire life cycle and you find out about it 3 days later. On the ontology side, this is fairly simple representation, but I basically just took inspiration from, I don't know if you folks have heard of Palantir has done a bunch of work on ontology. They're kind of trying to create this master data model of a business. And I was pointed to it by another member of the VSMI working group. And it essentially just splits the world into models and data, but I think that maps well to what we're aiming to represent. So we have metrics that pertain to performance, and we have events that are either notable or generating those metrics or influencing those metrics or behind those metrics. I think I would count kind of log data under events. And so I think that covers the full scope of what I would consider relevant data, but I'm interested in hearing from your perspective whether there's a piece of that missing or a granularity missing. And then under the model side, how do we think about entities, systems being the generators of events, entities also being the generators of events, but the representation of the objects primarily, and then the relationships between those, basically the relationships between everything.
I'm a bit confused. I don't make too much sense out of this picture, I'm afraid. So I can't really visualize what kind of information we are talking about here for the models and for the data. And
that's a good point. So maybe we're missing a layer of examples for this. But if we go back to these areas here, entities would be work items primarily, but also systems of work. So something like Jenkins, which is producing and consuming work, the work artifacts, and then contributors, so people who are involved in the work. Then systems being primarily the stores of data, and in many cases generating that data. And sometimes they're acting on that data, but in our world, they're primarily sort of generating and restoring and representing this data. And then metrics being all of the calculation of what's actually happening, and the events being the source of a lot of those metrics. And I think you probably have different naming for these things. The only thing that we didn't specify here is relationships, because relationships can really be whatever you define. But classical relationships would be an epic has many stories, a contributor contributes to multiple products and changes code on multiple code bases. All of these things could be potentially represented in relationships. But primarily, it's relationships is between entities and systems, because it has this primary job of relating what to what is connected to what, and then the data is really what's happening. So models pertaining to what matters, how are we representing the system, the overall system of work, and then data being what is happening within that system.
So the model is more static then, right? And the data is transient or happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, the data would reference the models in some way. So if I think when we talk about models, that is what we often maybe refer to as the source of an event. For example, so Jenkins.
Yeah, for example.
Instance could be a source of an event being sent.
Yeah.
But then we also talk about people. I mean, contributors could be not sources. That's right. For change, rather a contributor of a source change. So that's another. But then, yeah. So the data, the events we send would obviously contain references to such model entities, instances or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And sorry.
No. But
I think that's something that we have in CDEvents to a certain degree, but we don't have such like structured model. So like Emma was saying, we have sources of events, and we have like one open discussion that we want to have and how to better describe how like sources should be defined, structured. We have what we call subjects in our events that can refer to different entities, I guess, like environments. So you can have your production environment, your test environment, or things like that. Or so we have kind of this bits of data and models in our data model, but we don't have such kind of overarching visualization in CDEvents today. But it doesn't seem to be incompatible with what we may be doing. So at least that's, but yeah, so I think it should be possible to take data that you get from CDEvents today into this kind of model.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a useful characterization or even accurate. I'll have to think about how to label these things, but I think the idea is that these things are stored separately. So a metric, any given metric from the list could mean different things. It can mean different things to different people, depending on what model is representing that data, because it could be represented in multiple different ways in a system that is collecting and visualizing and analyzing the data. So this would leave it up to perhaps the value stream management platform to act on models, but even create and implement their own models for representing the data however it was meaningful to them, but be able to maybe leverage standard models and then create custom models using whatever representation was valuable in their context.
So where would, for example, a source change end up in this ontology? Is that
So,
or is it a entity?
I would say a source change would be captured as an event that may increment a metric, or captured in multiple different metrics that are breaking down that event into what it means to an extent, but that's based on representation, right? So the raw data would be captured in an event, and then it would be natively connected to an entity of an individual contributor, a work item, and maybe this is what we're missing. It's like a real life example of what this, because as I'm talking this through with you folks, I'm realizing that this is not cut and dry. It's connected to, it's somewhat interconnected. So you would have multiple entities represented in that event. You would have multiple systems represented at some point, but immediately you would have source control as a system that is associated with that event. And that would be extracted, I think, from the original event. So let's say that event comes through as a API call to a broker that is, or what you folks call protocol. So via the protocol comes into the data store and is maybe originally associated with one or multiple systems and multiple entities that have some defined relationship. So knowing that it's coming from, let's say, GitHub, we know that there is an existing representation that exists in the system already that represents source control, right? And it's like we have people who are creating code changes, and they are associated with branches and a repo and all these things. And we could think about that differently if we assigned a different model to it, if we gave that data to a different model. But primarily it has a pretty stable representation. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, in CDEvents, we have the concept of subjects and predicates. So for example, we have one subject is an incident, and the predicate then is that the incident is created or resolved, for example. So when I look at the entities list up there, you say incident is an entity, and I guess resolving an incident or creating an incident is actually an event. So could it be fair to say that the entities or the model up there is more of the subject onto which we perform some action, and the action is what we call a predicate in the CDEvents? Is that fair? Then also,
yeah.
source change would be a subject up in the model, and then when the source change is created or delivered or merged or something, then it's an activity or a predicate down in the data layer.
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
Okay. Because then it's another dimension of how we use it in CDEvents, because then, yeah, that can be interesting.
Yeah, but I think going back to the incident events, those they would contain more entities than the incident itself, because an incident event really can refer to a specific environment, and that environment would be an entity as well, and it could refer to a specific software version, and I imagine a specific application with a version could be an entity as well, if I understood correctly. So you have these entities kind of associated together within this event or activity.
Yeah, I would say that that's right.
But if I understood correctly, what you're saying is that the way that the activity our structure can exist independently of the representation, and so you can have multiple representation layered on top afterwards, based on the specific platform. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I would say that that's true. I would say that there's, and this is over engineering at this point. I don't think this is something that we would really prefer to support from day one, but probably because we have knowledge of representations in a value stream management context, and they're largely provided by the systems that are sending information. So we don't need to redefine their relationships, but in order to really associate these things, that's where I see the value of models, because you have this data coming from all these different places. All of them have different models, and they may be representing the data that we care about across all of these systems is the work item context, which each one will have a separate representation of natively, and we need to build a collective representation of that work globally across all the systems. So the part of the model goal is to basically say that all these things are the same thing. They're essentially, for our purposes, all of these separate things are the same thing. And coming from here, it looks like this. Coming from here, it looks like this. And in all those cases, we care about this aspect of the thing, and we are connecting all of them by this identification criteria that may vary quite a bit across all the systems.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense to me.
So I have to think more about, I will look at subjects and predicates as useful. I will check that out. And there's probably a lot I can incorporate from there.
Yeah, I think it's good if we can share some common vocabulary as much as possible also in this. There is an initiative to try to set the vocabulary on CD level, CI/CD level, and
right.
Probably that cannot be conformant all the way to the VSM in all aspects, but as much as possible, if we could, I think it would be valuable to somehow sync the vocabulary. And we intend to align the CDEvents vocabulary to that CDF interoperability defined reference vocabulary. So that this job here could also influence that. I believe it's not at all finished. So.
Well, folks, we always seem to use an hour.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about next steps? I think what we're aiming to do is publish what we've got at this point. I will do a pass referencing CDEvents vocabulary to make sure I can align that as much as possible. And we're going to basically publish a page or two, or it's probably going to be a couple of pages on what we have so far and how things are going, just to put something out into the world. And then I personally like this idea of the life cycle to demonstrate, and I like the idea of having an example of this. And then I was planning on revisiting the charter because I really I have to remind myself of what we committed to do and what we're trying to do. But
I believe it's finished even, so I think we need to settle on it as well together. So yeah, this is something
maybe that's what we tackle next time.
Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, I will be off for a long summer vacation now, actually, from starting from Monday next week. So I might not be able to join the next session if that would be in a few weeks. But I don't want the discussion to stop anyway, so please continue without me if you find it valuable.
Does this time generally work for folks? I mean, apart from, I know Emil, you're not going to be there in a couple of weeks, but
I think this is fine for me.
Okay.
I hope it could work fine, yeah.
Yeah. So should I kind of extend this into kind of recurring meetings, so we have like a next session that we can sync, continue working on the charter, see if there is any other follow-up from this, and define next steps? Sounds good to me.
Yep, sounds good to me.
Every second week or something like that, or every third week, or what do you think is decent pace?
I think every third week will give us enough opportunity. I think we actually, every 3 weeks might be too frequent, because we've got, I think we're only meeting monthly for the VSMI TC. Okay. So our cadence is monthly, and we wouldn't have too much progress intermonth.
We can make this monthly as well. I think that's fine from my perspective. If we don't see the need to rush this quicker than so anyway.
Right. So we could say this is the fourth Tuesday of the month. So if we follow that pattern, next time would be like on the 25th of July. Does that work?
Works for me. Emil, are you back by then?
No, I will not be back then, but I will be back for the one after that in August. I will be back.
Okay, that's fine.
And I will be away for the one in August, I'm afraid.
Okay, and we go overlap, but yeah, that's fine.
I have a question as a even greener than a beginner. So for example, for financial industry, the Finos Foundation have a thing called CDM, Common Data Model, for finance related topics. So those model will be what you describe on your picture, that model versus data. That will be part of that model part, right?
That's what I would. Yeah, that's what I would expect, is that any kind of data model that you wanted. And that's another good use case, is being able to pull in models from other places and have representations, to borrow representations that already exist and that are relevant in specific contexts. Because you might have the same model in the insurance industry or in healthcare or elsewhere.
Similarly, like for example, in the security realm, there's a thing called OSCO. That's kind of common reporting compliance model that will also apply, right, for special use cases. That's like not for industry, but for security. That also is model, and then data is just whatever is related to that model.
Right.
Matrix. Okay.
Unfortunately, I've got to jump to the technical committee call.
Yeah.
But thanks for the time, everybody. Good to see you.
Yeah. See you.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye bye.
See you next time.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.